Well, good morning, brethren. Very, very beautiful, special music. I've certainly appreciated all the effort and the time that those involved in our special music this year have put into it, because I think it's really been very outstanding. As indeed this entire Feast of Tabernacles has been for us, I think it has been one of the very best that we have enjoyed over the years. Things have gone along very well, and certainly God has blessed us with some very beautiful early fall weather. We live in a very, very rapidly changing world. It is incredible when you look back just a matter of the last 2 years, particularly here at the fall festival season. If you just recall back 2 years ago, right before the fall festival season of 1989, the very beginnings of serious unrest and unraveling in the area that was known as behind the Iron Curtain, that area of Eastern and Central Europe, that was just really beginning to come unraveled, or to threaten unraveling, as problems were going on in Poland, strikes and various things that finally resulted in a sharing of the government with the Communist Party and non-communists. And this was an unprecedented matter. It was something that had not occurred successfully since the conclusion of World War II. And within a matter of days, the entire post-World War II system just began to unravel as the unrest spread very, very quickly. And many of us watched on our television sets in our motel rooms during Feast of Tabernacles that year 1989, as seemingly one after another of these governments behind the Iron Curtain began to collapse in terms of their communist authority and communist power. And the most dramatic, of course, was the situation in East Germany and the people streaming across into West Germany. The excitement. You couldn't watch something like that and not be really moved by the desire that these people had for freedom, for many of the things that we take for granted. And even at that time, of course, commentators said, well, this doesn't mean that, Germany will be reunited. And certainly if that happens, that's, months and that's years, decades away. But last Feast of Tabernacles, that occurred at the beginning of the feast. This year, of course, right prior to the feast, the most unthinkable of events in the aftermath of World War II occurred with the unrest in the Soviet Union. Can you imagine a more unbelievable headline of a few years ago than a headline like, Communist Party banned in Russia? You think about that. That's about as improbable a headline as someone could come up with. The point is that we live in a world that is very rapidly changing. There is certainly a vacuum that has been created, because what we have to understand is that communism represented a religion. It was a belief system. It was a value system. It was a worldview that people held. And that whole system of belief, that whole system of values has in many ways collapsed. There are very few true believers left anymore. If you exclude Castro and the aging leadership of China, perhaps a few Harvard professors, there's not really very many true believers left in that regard. But what has happened, and I think that there's some things that tie in very directly with this Feast of Tabernacles. Because, the early communist philosophers and leaders, men like Marx and Lenin, made a reference to religion, very disparaging reference to religion, as being the opiate of the people. And by that, they meant that religion was used to sort of dull people into a spirit of slumber, to give up on any of the things that could and should be done in this world. It was used to simply focus their attention on some never land that was going to come someday, the hereafter, and It was, they said, they felt, used as a mind control technique. It was used as a means of controlling the masses. And of course the reality is that is the way that religion has been used by many people and certainly many leaders down through the centuries. In many ways you can look that there have been two basic approaches toward life. One being characterized by our modern Western secular approach to life, which is a total emphasis on this is it. Get everything you can get right now, right here. Communications and the awareness that people behind the Iron Curtain began to have about the prosperity that existed in the West and the increased communications and the increasing inability of the governments to prevent people in many of the Eastern and Central European areas from really grasping the disparity that was existing more and more between East and West. This fueled a lot of the unrest because, after all, communism had presented itself as the maker, the producer of a utopia, a workers' paradise. But you see, it was a workers' paradise they had to build a wall around and post guards at the gate, not to keep people from the outside from breaking in, but to keep all the workers from leaving paradise. And it became apparent as soon as the wall came down that all the workers wanted to leave what was purported to be a workers' paradise. So the very thing that they had offered, which was right here, right now, we're going to produce utopia on earth, after over 70 years of power in the Soviet Union, it was apparent that that was not the case. In fact, they were in exactly the role that they had always accused religion of being, and that was saying that, some way, someday, this utopia will eventually result, and we must sacrifice now for the future. But when people lost faith in the future, they got tired of sacrificing. Many religions, particularly many of the Eastern religions, have had a very ascetic approach to life. They have emphasized self-denial. This was often the case in the medieval period, the early Catholic monastic orders that really de-emphasized the world today and said, look, today's world, this doesn't count. The only thing that counts is the hereafter. And you can see this approach, particularly, as I say, many of the religions of the East have emphasized this sort of self-denial that the enjoyment of pleasures and the enjoyment of things here and now is not something that should be enjoyed. That's not in keeping with religion, but rather a denial now and just a looking for the future. Well, you contrast that with the approach that is so frequent and so common in our modern secular world, which is an entire emphasis on forget about the hereafter, forget about the future. The emphasis is right here, right now. Get it all now. This is all there is. Well, we look at that, and I think we can all understand and recognize that neither holds the balance. Neither produces fulfillment, neither produces satisfaction, neither approach is really a godly, balanced, biblical approach. How do we balance living in hope and anticipation of the world tomorrow with living and functioning in the world today? How do we balance those two things? Most of mankind's religions and philosophies have not been able to focus on a properly balanced approach. Over a period of time, they have tended to go to one extreme or the other. But we ask ourselves the question, how do we make this balance? What are the principles by which we can have a proper balance of, on the one hand, living in hope and anticipation of the world to come, and yet living and functioning in the world today? Well, I would like for us today to understand more clearly how this very festival that we're here celebrating right now this week holds the key to an understanding of the true balance that God would have us to understand. Now, let's step back for just a few moments And let's look at something. Mr. Kaplan yesterday mentioned the number 4 and the significance of various groups of 4 in connection with the Feast of Tabernacles. And as he was commenting on that, it struck me of another set of 4s that I want to bring to your attention. Now, traditionally, in the Jewish community, the book of Ecclesiastes has been the book that was read during the Feast of Tabernacles. The book of Ecclesiastes was viewed as pertaining very directly to the fall festival season, to the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is one of 5 books that are termed in the Jewish order of the Old Testament Scriptures, that the basic order that the Jews have preserved from antiquity, the threefold division of the law, the prophets, and the writings. The book of Ecclesiastes fits in that section of the writings. It fits in a group of 5 books called the Megalot. And this particular book, the 5 festival scrolls, consisting of Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Now, each of these festival scrolls was read at a particular festival season. 3 of them were read at the 3 main festival seasons, the 3 seasons in the year that were pilgrim festivals, at which God's people assembled. In Jerusalem, the Song of Solomon was read at the early spring season, the Passover, unleavened bread season. Ruth was read at Pentecost, the second of the 3 festival seasons, and the book of Ecclesiastes was read at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, in addition to that, there were a couple of national occasions that the other 2 books were read during, these occasions being the fast of Ab, the fast of the 5th month, which was a commemoration of the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. The book of Lamentations was read at that time. This occurred normally in our July-August period during the late summer. And then the book of Esther, which was read at the occasion of Purim, which was a celebration of deliverance of the Jews from the Persians, from destruction. This was in the, very end of winter period, just the 12th month of the year, just about a month or so prior to the Passover season. So, these books were repetitively read in these occasions through the year, and there was material there that corresponded to these occasions. Now, I don't want to go into all of the different occasions, but the 4th of these 5 books was the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, along with the 5 festival scrolls that corresponded to these 5 different occasions through the year, there were also a couple of other groups of 5 that were compared or paralleled to the 5 festival scrolls. Because you see, just as there were 5 festival scrolls, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther, there were also 5 books of Moses, 5 books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And each of these books were and can be paralleled with its corresponding number of the festival scrolls. And in addition to that, there were also, in terms of reckoning, that the book of Psalms was traditionally reckoned as being divided into 5 sections or 5 books of the Psalms. If you look closely in your Bible, you can find that this division is retained. You'll find, if you look through there, that Psalms 1 through 41 constitute the first book of the Psalms. If you notice Psalm 41, it ends with a double amen. Psalms 42 through 72 correspond to the second book. Psalms 73 through 89, the third book. 90 through 106, the fourth book. And 107 through 50, the fifth book. And there is a parallel in terms of the content. You can parallel the content of each of these 5 festival scrolls with its corresponding number in the Torah and in the books of Psalms. Now, I don't intend to go through all of that, but what I do intend to focus our attention on primarily is the book of Ecclesiastes, which would correspond with as to what was traditionally read at this season. And we will also notice some corresponding in information and instruction, some corresponding parallel in the book of Numbers, which is the fourth book of the Torah, as well as from the Psalms, particularly drawn from the fourth section of the Psalms. So you've got some more fours to tie in with the Feast of Tabernacles, the corresponding material from the fourth of the festival scrolls, the fourth book of the Torah, as well as the fourth section of the Psalms. Now we'll notice some of these parallels as we go through. Just in terms of sort of a brief summary, the book of Ecclesiastes focuses obviously on the very temporary and finite nature of the life that we live. There is a focus on the temporary and on a distinction between what is temporary and what is permanent in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, we're celebrating a festival that is a feast of temporary dwellings. The Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, as it is sometimes translated, Sukkot in the Hebrew, is a term that is a reference to temporary dwellings. So we're looking at a festival of the temporary. A festival that by its name and its nature focuses our attention on certain things that are temporary. We see that a book was read that focuses in a great deal on what is temporary and a distinction between the temporary and the permanent. We find in Leviticus 23, it's been read earlier, I will focus your attention on it. In Leviticus 23, where we're told in verse 34 that the 15th day of the 7th month is the Feast of Tabernacles, on down in verse 42, we're told, you shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now, here is an emphasis here is a tie-in of the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles with the period of time that Israel was wandering in the wilderness. Now, the book of Numbers tells the story of Israel in the wilderness. It tells the story of Israel under the government of God, because the government of God was exercised more directly in the time of Moses, more directly in the time of the 40 years in the wilderness than any other comparable period that I believe can be pointed to in biblical history. The government of God was very directly and dramatically exercised. God was very directly involved. Right on down to providing food and water and drink. He directly led, He guided, He intervened in direct, dramatic, daily ways. So, in many ways, there is a parallel to a time that is to come. But the book of Numbers is the story of Israel in their role as heirs of a promise, not yet inheritors. They were in a temporary state. And of course, the millennium is a temporary state. It is 1,000 years. That is finite. It will have an end. It is not the ultimate. So here is the story of Israel under the period of God's government in a temporary circumstance, living in a way that reminded them of the transitory nature of their circumstances. Now, I mentioned the Psalms and the fourth section of the Psalm, which begins with Psalm 90. The first Psalm of each section really sort of sets the theme and gives you sort of a summary of the theme of that particular section. And that really, we're going to note here in Psalm 90 in just a few moments, because we're going to note a verse that really sort of sets the theme of this fourth section of the Psalms. Because as we go through, and particularly we're going to notice a few other things elsewhere in the Bible, but particularly we're going to concentrate on the book of Ecclesiastes with material from Numbers and from this section of the Psalms, particularly Psalm 90. And As we do, I think that we will derive from this portion of Scripture some basic points that really explain to us what is the balanced perspective between living our lives in hope and anticipation of the world to come and also living our lives in a functioning, productive way in the world today. There is a balance, and it is a balance that I think that as we go through and see some of God's instruction, we can understand. Now, to begin with, let's notice here in Psalm 90, we'll pick it up in verse 10, it says, the days of our years are 70. They're 70. And if by reason of strength they be 80, be 80, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it's soon cut off and we fly away. On down in verse 12, so teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. One of the points, one of the focuses that is brought out here in Psalm 90 has to do with the temporary, finite nature of human life. Human life on this planet, by God's design, is of a very finite, temporary nature. Basically, the psalmist writes, people live about 70 years. And some, because of perhaps heredity, because of greater stamina and strength, may go on into their 80s. But the point is, regardless of whether it's our 70s or 80s, or in some few cases on up into the 90s and beyond, the point is that it's temporary, it's going to come to an end, and the key is verse 12, so teach us to number our days. Teach us, the psalmist writes, and Moses is the one, we're told, who wrote the 90th Psalm. Well, Moses lived to be 120. But you see, the point was still as applicable to him as it was to anyone else. Teach us to number our days. Teach us to recognize, help us to perceive and to grasp the temporary length of time that we have, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. So the first thing that we have to do, the principle that is basic to any sort of balance between living and functioning in today's world and living in hope and anticipation of tomorrow's world, one of the first keys, the most important things, and something that relates very directly to this feast of temporary dwellings, is a consciousness of the finite nature of time. A consciousness of the finite nature of man's life. To recognize the temporary, finite nature of time as it relates to human beings. Because time for us is very limited and very fleeting. The point is, teach us to number our days, teach us to recognize this, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. You see, none of you, nor did I, come into the world with some guarantee of how many years we have. And it doesn't matter whether you're young or old. Many times when we're young and we're healthy, we think, well, boy, I've got years ahead. Well, perhaps you do. Hopefully you do. But the obituary column of the newspaper in any city of any size is going to contain the names of those who are young. Those who are in their teens, those who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s. just the same as those who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s. The point is, none of us arrive with a guarantee of exactly a certain amount of time, that our time is by its nature temporary and fleeting. We have to recognize the transitory nature of it, that our life is temporary, and therefore we need to make productive use. We need to make every day count, whether we're young or old. Because none of us knows how many days. The only thing we know is that today we have one day less than we did yesterday. You see, we know the amount of days behind. We don't know the amount of days in the future. So it is important to have a view of life recognizing the temporary nature, the finiteness of that which is human, and therefore seek to apply our hearts unto wisdom. Now, Solomon makes this point in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 1, and I'm going to be reading in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm going to be reading from the Jewish Publication Society translation, the Sonsino edition, which has the 5 books of the Megillot in one volume, that provides not only text but commentary on these portions, very similar to the King James, most of the translations. So I don't think, but you'll notice some variation. In Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 2, it says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has man of all his labor wherein he labors under the sun? One generation passes away, another generation comes, the earth abides forever." The book of Ecclesiastes opens with a focus on the temporary, transitory, passing nature of human life. You get up, you work, you go to bed, you live your life, one generation passes, another generation comes, the earth goes on and on. Human life on this planet is very finite, very temporary. And the distinction of a matter of a few years, less or more, is very, very small in the overall scheme of things. Let's go on in the book of Ecclesiastes. So we see a focus here on the fact that things are very temporary. On back in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we're told that the world that we live in is a cyclical world. There are cycles that things go on. In Ecclesiastes 3:1, we're told to everything there's a season, a time, to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted. So, we live in a world that is temporary, a world that is filled with ongoing seasons and cycles of life. What we build as human beings is not by its nature permanent, because it will eventually erode. It will decay. Some things obviously can last far longer than others, but eventually these things decay. They deteriorate. They wear away. Man's efforts, man's labors, the things that man does are temporary, as man himself is temporary. On back further in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 8. Chapter 8 of the book of Ecclesiastes, we'll pick it up in verse 6. We're told to every matter there is a time and judgment. For the evil of man is great upon him. For he knows not that which shall be. For even when it comes to pass, who shall declare it unto him? There's no man that has power over the Spirit to retain the wind or the Spirit. The Hebrew word is ruach, which can be rendered either wind or spirit, but most commentators agree that the Spirit is what is being referred to here, because it's talking about death. There's no man that has power over his spirit to retain his spirit, neither has he power over the day of death. There's no discharge in that war. You know, in ancient times particularly, someone who was wealthy could pay others to go to war in his place. This was common even on up to the time of the American War between the states, particularly in the North. It was not uncommon that when the draft was enacted, provision was made that those who were wealthy could hire, so if their turn came, they could hire somebody to go in their place. And this sort of thing, now we're more sophisticated. We have systems of deferments and various things, but the point is, anciently it was not uncommon. If somebody had wealth and position and power, he didn't want to go to war, he could get a replacement. But there is a war you don't get a replacement in. I don't care how wealthy you are. I don't care how big your bank account is. There's no discharge in that war. There's no scheme, no wicked scheme that's going to deliver any individual here in this matter of death. You see, the point is, to every matter there is a time and judgment. A lot of things happen. But ultimately, what it comes down to is when the time to die comes, no one has the power to retain that spirit of man within him. They don't have power over the day of death. There's no discharge. You don't get a replacement when that time comes. There's no way you can buy your way out of that or scheme your way out of it. There is a limit that man is faced with. The finite, limited nature of man and everything that pertains to him. In the ninth chapter of Ecclesiastes, in verse 11, Solomon writes, I returned and I saw under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. But time and chance happens to them all, for man also knows not his time. As the fishes that are taken in an evil net, and as the birds that are caught in the snare, even so are the sons of men snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. The point is, things can come quickly. It's not always as it will appear to be. The race is not always to the swift. The battle is not always to the strong. No matter how much we prepare, no matter how much we do, no matter how diligently our plans are pursued, there are things beyond our power that can impact us. And we can be taken by surprise, just like fish weren't expecting to be caught in a net or the bird in a snare. So events can befall us, and we can be taken just as quickly and just as completely. We can be taken. So the point is that there is a finite, temporary nature to everything that is human. And that's the first and that is a crucial point to recognize if we're going to have a balanced perspective on life and living. Now let's go on, because that's not all there is to do. But if we recognize the temporary nature, whether we're young or old, that things are temporary when it relates to human beings, and we therefore need to apply our hearts unto wisdom. Now let's understand a little bit about that wisdom. What does God want us to do? Well, as far as the world today, it is important, and God has designed us to be productive. God wants us to be productive, and there is enjoyment that is to be derived through being productive. But our modern secular world has become so materialistic and so much involved in the rat race. People don't stop to think, when you have a rat race, who's going to win? Well, the rats are. So we live in a world that is picking up speed, that is going increasingly so fast. Now, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 24, there's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink and make his soul enjoy pleasure for his labor. This also I saw, that it's from the hand of God. So Solomon said, yes, to enjoy the fruits of your labor, to enjoy pleasure for your labor. to work, to be productive, and to enjoy the fruits of what you have produced. That's good. Solomon said there's nothing better under the sun. There's nothing better from a physical standpoint. God has made us in His own image, after His likeness, and God, we're told, is a creator. God is productive. God introduces Himself to us in the Scripture as the creator. God derived pleasure and satisfaction from what He did at the end of creation week. At the end of the sixth day, the Lord God, we're told, beheld all that He had made, and behold, it was very good. God stepped back and looked, and He derived pleasure and satisfaction. We have within us the need to derive pleasure and satisfaction from the fruits of our labor. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 9 says, "What profit has he that works in that he labors? I've seen the task which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also He set the world in their hearts." Now, some translations render this word world, render it eternity. Because the Hebrew word olam is a word that basically signifies eternity. It signifies a sense of time, of past, present, and future. God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has set within us, in something that sets human beings apart from animals, He has set within us a sense of infinity, a sense of eternity, a sense of time, of past and future. You know, animals simply live in the present. But we have set within us a desire for that which reaches beyond the temporary. See, what's the profit? What do we get out of what we labor? Solomon says, I see the things that people labor with, and everything is beautiful in its time, but we have within us a desire for something more. We have within us a desire for something that goes beyond the temporary. Coming on down a little bit later, in verse 12, "I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice, to get pleasure, or to do good. There's nothing better than to rejoice, to do good, so long as they live. But also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy pleasure for all his labor. This is the gift of God." So, what do we get out of being productive? We have a desire within us for something that goes beyond the beauty of the moment. There's nothing better under the sun than to enjoy your life, to do good as opportunity presents itself, to eat and drink, to enjoy the benefits of your labor. This is God's gift to enable us to do that. Let's go on a little further. Chapter 4, in verse 4. Solomon brings out another point. He says, "Again, I considered all labor and all excelling in work, that it is a man's rivalry with his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind." As one of the commentators brings out, this very literally rendered would be from jealousy of one toward another. Solomon said, I looked at labor, I took a second look at labor and the skill and the excelling that took place, and I realized how much occurs motivated by jealousy and envy. People do something not from the motive of doing the best that they can do, but they do it from the motive of getting one up on their neighbor. The whole basis of so much of our modern secular materialistic world is based on a spirit of jealousy and envy and rivalry with our neighbors. And so people have pursued this endless pursuit. And our list of needs has continually expanded. Most people in certainly the Western world simply cannot distinguish between a want and a need. If they want it, they think they need it. And we have so pursued this materialistic binge that we stand right now at the point of sacrificing an entire generation of our youth on the altar to materialism. Because parents are too busy pursuing materialistic pursuits. Life is too hectic. You know, brethren, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of whether our priorities are in a materialistic vein or whether they're in a better vein. Well, Solomon says, I considered all labor and all excelling in work. It's a man's rivalry. It's his jealousy with his neighbor that is a motivating factor in so many cases. And this is vanity and striving after wind. It's emptiness. It's futile. Now, there's another extreme, verse 5, the fool folds his hands together and eats his own flesh. You know, the opposite extreme is the guy that doesn't do anything, just sort of sits there with his hands folded, and he'll just eventually consume away, starve to death, if that's the approach that he's going to take. There's a balance in between. See, verse 6 is the balance. Better is a handful of quietness than both hands full of labor and striving after wind. There is a balance. You don't have to go to one extreme or the other. There is a balance. It's better to have a handful with the quietness and the peace to be able to enjoy that handful than both hands full and continually striving in the rat race and never able to stop and enjoy either one. So it's far better, Solomon says, to have some and to take the time to enjoy that and to make the best out of that than to try to just always be getting more and more and never be able to derive the benefit from it. Now let's go on back in Ecclesiastes 9. Ecclesiastes 9. In verse 5 it says, the living know that they shall die, the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward. The memory of them is forgotten, as well as their love, their hatred, their envy. It's long ago perished, neither have they any more portion forever in anything that's done under the sun. This physical life is over for them, and all of their feelings and their desires and their love and their hatred and their envy, all of these things are gone. They're dead. So he says, verse 7. You see, again, we're looking at things are temporary. It's going to come to an end. The living know that they're going to die, but the dead don't know anything. Their time in this physical world in which we live is over. So what should we do? Verse 7, go your way. Eat your bread with joy. Drink your wine with a merry heart. For God has already accepted your works. Let your garments be always white. Let your head lack no oil. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of the life, this temporary, transitory life, which God has given you under the sun. All the days of this transitory period. For that is your portion in life and in your labor when you labor under the sun. Whatsoever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there's no device nor strength nor knowledge in the grave where you go. So, what does he say? Look, it's going to be over with. So enjoy life. Enjoy the fruits of your labor and enjoy it with the wife whom you love all the days of your life. So we find that God wants us to be productive. There's nothing better, God tells us through Solomon, there's nothing better in this physical life than to be productive, to derive satisfaction and pleasure from what we do, to enjoy the fruits of our labors, to enjoy the love of a wife and a family. There's nothing better under the sun. Not to get caught up in the rivalry, the envy, the jealousy, the striving after wind of competition with a neighbor. It's better to have a handful with quietness than two handfuls striving after wind. Yes, God says we have a need to be productive. God wants us to be productive. But He also wants us to avoid a materialistic rat race. To realize there's nothing better than enjoying life in the context of a happy marriage, a family that loves you, to enjoy the love and the company of human beings who love and care for one another, to enjoy the results of our productive effort, to derive pleasure from those efforts, and to avoid the materialistic binge motivated by strife and envy that so greatly grips our Western secular world and has, of course, gripped various societies at various times. Various individuals within those societies. Now, let's go on. We see, let's look at another point that is crucial if we are to have a balanced perspective. We must grasp the temporary nature of things. We must be productive in a balanced way, being productive and enjoying, yet taking the time to enjoy the love of our family, not getting caught up in the rat race. And thirdly, it is vital that if we're going to keep our perspective, that we must greatly cherish and appreciate and value the promises that God makes. We must cherish God's promises. You know, too many times people find themselves in a state of affairs that is less than ideal, and they begin looking back at the so-called good old days. Now that is very much the story of the book of Numbers, which we're going to note in just a moment. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 10, it says, "Say not you, how was it that the former days were better than these? For it's not out of wisdom that you inquire concerning this." In other words, as the commentator brings out, it's unwise when troubles come upon you to grow peevish and imagine that your past life was free of these trials. The earlier years were probably no better than the present. Now, let's go back to an illustration in the book of Numbers. We could spend a lot of time in the book of Numbers, an entire sermon in the book of Numbers. But let's go back. Here's the story, the fourth book of the Torah, a book that tells the story of Israel in the position of heirs in a temporary state, awaiting entrance into the promised land, yet a time under God's government and His guidance. They were on their way. But you see, there were difficulties and there were obstacles. Now, we have the account in Numbers chapter 13 of the spies going in to spy out the land. They came back with a report, and the report included the fact that there were obstacles. Now, in Numbers 14:1, we're told the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and all the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron and against the whole and the whole congregation said unto them, "Would God we had died in the land of Egypt! Would God we had died in the wilderness! You brought us out here to this land to fall by the sword. Let's make us a captive and return to Egypt." Now, is this a case of saying, you know, it wasn't so bad back in Egypt. We'd be better off back there. One of the shortest verses in the Bible tells us to remember Lot's wife. Lot's wife ceased to value what God offered. She looked back longingly at the society she was leaving behind. She couldn't quite turn her back on it and walk away, never looking back. She couldn't turn loose of it in her heart. The children of Israel had trouble turning loose of Egypt. And part of the reason they had trouble turning loose is because they weren't thankful and appreciative in their hearts for what God was giving them. They looked at the difficulties and the obstacles of their temporary circumstance. They were overwhelmed by those difficulties, and they were overwhelmed because they took their eyes off of the reality of the great promises that God had. You're never going to make it past temporary difficulties if you lose sight of the value of God's promises. There is a progression of thought that takes someone out of the church. I am convinced that it is the line of thought that certainly has had a detrimental effect on many of our young people who those who have left God's church. Certainly many of our young people have not, and I think that one of the greatest differences between those who have stayed and those who have not is found in an approach to life that's given in Romans chapter 1. That is the story of what happened in terms of all humanity reasoning itself astray. We're told in Romans 1:21, because that when they knew God, and you know there was a time when the whole human race knew God. Certainly when Noah got off the ark, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, they all knew God. You know, there was no great demand for the booklet, Does God Exist? They all knew that. They knew about God. They knew certain things about God. But here we're told, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. There was a progression. Starting from knowing God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. They did not focus on an appreciation for what God was giving them. They ceased to value and to cherish what God was offering. And the result was they began to trust in their own reasoning, their own understanding. They elevated their ideas above God's ideas, above God's Word. And the result was then they began to lose any understanding they had had. But you see, a lack of appreciation, a lack of thankfulness is a very dangerous spiritual state. Ecclesiastes says, don't say, start looking back and say, boy, it always used to be better than this. I've heard people who've had that attitude as they would sort of look back. Well, back before I came into church, I didn't have some of these problems. No, you may not have had some of these, but you had other problems. And if you look back and view your past prior to coming into the church through rose-colored glasses and think, boy, it was so simple back in Egypt. That's exactly what Israel did, as recorded in the book of Numbers. We could go on. We could go through the book of Numbers a little later. We could see the sin with the Midianite women. Again, they lost sight of what God had offered them. They took the allure. They took the things of the world today, and they lost sight of what was to come. We're told in Hebrews 11, Moses didn't do that. Moses had far more going for him than any of them had going for them. He left and forsook far more in Egypt because he chose to identify with the people of God rather than with Pharaoh and Pharaoh's family. So, it is crucial that we, if we're going to maintain a balance in our life, that we cherish God's promises, that we maintain a thankful, appreciative attitude of deeply valuing what God gives, what God offers, what God holds out to us. Because if and when we begin to regard God's promises cheaply, we cease to be thankful and appreciative and value those and begin to sort of look back at the good old days prior to conversion. And think, boy, if I'd known there were all these problems. That is an unrealistic view of the past. And it loses sight of a very realistic view of the future. It's realistic because it's based on the accuracy of the promises of God. It is the story of much of what happened to the Israelites as recorded in the book of Numbers. Now let's go on. There is one other point that I wish to make. In addition to recognizing the limitation and finiteness of time, in addition to being, yes, productive, but not getting caught up in the materialistic rat race, in addition to cherishing and valuing God's promises first and foremost, there is one more point that is crucial, and that has to do with the paramount place in our lives that God's law must maintain. God's law must be retained in our thinking. It must maintain a paramount place in our life, in governing and ordering our steps. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, we'll pick it up down here in verse 9. It says, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth, and walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know you that for all these things God will bring you unto judgment. Therefore remove vexation from your heart and put away evil from your flesh. Childhood and youth are vanity. They're very fleeting, very temporary. says, look, young people, enjoy life. Pursue your goals. Pursue your dreams. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. Yes, pursue your goals and your dreams. There's nothing wrong with that. But understand that there is an accountability that every one of us has, whether we're young or old. We all must give account to God for our actions. So pursue goals and dreams and ambitions, but do so lawfully. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. It's not just for the time when we're old. Now, if we were to go back to the book of 1 Kings, we have the story of King Solomon. We'll pick it up in 1 Kings chapter 4. I want to focus on a couple of things here, because in many ways, Solomon was the author of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon's life provided the background for the experience and the insight that is recorded in the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon's name is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. And in many ways, Solomon's reign was a type of that time that we call the millennium. Let's just notice a couple of things here. And in 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 1, King Solomon was king over all Israel. Goes through the administrative system that he had. And in verse 20 we're told that Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river, that is the river Euphrates, unto the land of the Philistines up on the Mediterranean. So he ruled over an area that would go to the border of portions of what is now northern Iraq on down, through portions of what would be modern day nations, include portions modern day nations of Syria and Lebanon and the state of Israel and the nation of Jordan on down even into portions of Egypt. He went down to the border of Egypt. Solomon reigned over a vast empire there in the Middle East. Many of these other areas that were tributary to him, they brought presents, we're told in verse 21, and served Solomon all the days of his life. So he reigned over Israel and he reigned over the surrounding peoples as the king over them. They were tributary to him. He maintained a tremendous court and retinue. It's recorded here in verses 22 and 23. Just the provisions it took on a daily basis to provide there in the court of King Solomon. This was not just Solomon what he ate, but obviously it included the entire administrative staff. But it was gives us an idea of the tremendous wealth and the tremendous things that Solomon had, because there was a utilization. It says 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, which would be more coarsely ground flour. Well, you're looking here at the equivalent of almost 270 gallons of flour. That's a lot of bread. You don't normally measure flour in gallons, but this would nevertheless give you an idea. 10 fat oxen and 20 oxen out of the pasture. I mean, you're slaughtering 30 oxen a day. 100 sheep besides harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. They lost count of the chickens and the wild game. Now you're looking at a lot of people. He had dominion over a vast area. And notice in the end of verse 24, he had peace on all sides round about him, and Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan unto Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now this verse 25 we find quoted one other place in the scriptures. It's quoted back in the book of Micah. Just hold your place here and go back in the book of Micah chapter 4. Micah 4:1 starts out, in the last days it'll come to pass, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established. Many nations will come. We're told in verse 2. In verse 4 we're told, they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. That's a prophecy of the millennium. Solomon's reign was a type of that. Every man sat under his own vine and his own fig tree, and none were to make them afraid. You know, when you look at all this unrest all over the world, the civil unrest and the ethnic strife, problems in Europe, problems in Eastern and Central Europe, problems in the Balkans, you can look at it in Africa, you can look at it in Asia, you can look at it around the world, all of the factions and the fracturing. But you know, ultimately, what do people want? They want what we're here celebrating. They want to be able to sit under their own vine and their own fig tree and none to make them afraid. That's what all the strife is going on about. They want the right to have their own place and to have it in peace and security with nobody to make them afraid. Israel had that in the days of Solomon. The whole world is going to enjoy it in the time of Christ's reign in the future. That's what they want. They want peace and security. They want to have their own spot and nobody threatening to take it away from them. Sit under their own vine, their own fig tree, none to make them afraid. You know, this is what Israel had. It was a type of the millennium. God gave Solomon, verse 29, He gave him wisdom and understanding. Tremendous wisdom and insight. We're told that Solomon, well, in verse 34, there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth. So the whole world sought to Solomon and sought to understand his ways, the things, God's ways through him. Now chapter 6 gives us the story of the building of the temple and the construction there. We go through the building of the temple, the establishment of that, and we see that Solomon's reign started off in a tremendous way. It was in so many ways a type of the millennium. It was a time of peace and security and prosperity. It was a time of abundance. It was a time of happiness and joy. All of these things are descriptive of Solomon's reign. That was one of the first things the Queen of Sheba noticed when she came to visit Solomon. Happy are your servants. She noticed the happiness and the joy that pervaded. But there was a problem. Chapter 11 of 1 Kings tells us that King Solomon loved many strange women. And it enumerates various ones God had told the Israelites not to intermarry with, but Solomon did. And we're told in verse 4, it came to pass when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart to other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord, as was the heart of David his father. Solomon did evil. Solomon lost sight of God's law. You know, in Deuteronomy chapter 31, Israel was told in Deuteronomy 31 verses 9 through 12, that every sabbatical year, in the 7th year, when all of Israel assembled to keep the feast, the law was to be read. It was to be read, the whole law. And they were told that this was to be done, verse 12 of Deuteronomy 31, gather everybody together, that they may hear, that they may learn, and fear the eternal your God, and observe to do all the works, the words of the law. They were to hear it. They were to learn from what they heard. They were, as a result, to fear the Lord, to stand in awe and reverence of God, and that was to carry over into observing to do it. The law and the reading of the law was very integral to the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, because you know Deuteronomy 14 tells us that we come to the feast for two reasons. We come before God that we might learn to fear the eternal our God, as Mr. Manzanares brought out in the sermonette. That means to stand in reverent awe of God, not to be cowering in a corner somewhere, but to stand in awe of God, to be deeply impressed with Him. We come to learn to fear God, to stand in awe of God, and we come to rejoice before Him. Now, the law was read so that they would hear it, and as a result of hearing it, they could learn it. As a result of learning it, it could be ingrained into the way they think. It would change the way they think to becoming deeply impressed with God, which would carry over into the way they acted, observing to do it. Solomon started off, his reign was a type of the millennium, but you see, the millennium of Solomon didn't end up the way God's millennium is. It didn't end up that way because the law was lost sight of. Solomon allowed himself to be turned aside from focusing on observing God's law. And you see, that's the final point that it makes right here in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 12:13. The end of the matter, all having been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole man. This is what it's all about. Fear God, stand in awe and reverence of God, and keep His commandments. Because the law of God is directly intertwined with our attitude of reverence and respect and esteem for God. The world has never gotten the balance in terms of living. There is a void, there is a spiritual vacuum in Eastern Europe that is wide open. There's an emptiness. The people have followed false gods that promised one thing and weren't able to deliver it. They followed the false gods of communism, but before that they had followed other false gods, and they will follow others yet future. That's the tragedy. We're here celebrating the time when the true God, the God of heaven, is going to set up a kingdom. And finally, they're going to gain those things that they're looking for. Right now, we're living, we're functioning. God has called us out of this world. We're here observing the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the world's religions have gone from one end to the other. Some have focused exclusively on the hereafter and said, just, deny yourself, don't enjoy life, just live this ascetic, monastic sort of life here and now, because the whole emphasis is the future. Others have taken, and our modern secular age has taken an opposite view. Get it all right now. A materialistic, secular, hedonistic view of life. Here in God's festival, this Feast of Temporary Dwellings, this Feast of Tabernacles, we have things that focus our attention on the godly balance that God would have us to have. A recognition of the limits and the finite nature of human life and human endeavor. A focus on the fact that, yes, we should be productive and achieve and accomplish, but not in a way that takes away from our ability to enjoy human relationships, to savor the relationships of a loving wife and family. Not being productive for reasons of envy and jealousy, but being productive to derive the pleasure from what we do and to derive and enjoy the benefits of what we do with those that we love. A focus in on God's promises and the value of those promises, never losing sight of it, and the recognition that God's law must rule our lives. Because you see, God's law, as we hear it, as we learn it, it changes the way we think. It brings us to a point of standing in awe of God, being impressed with Him, that carries over into what we do. And you see, to fear God and keep His commandments. That's what it's all about. Because that is the way to savor the best of the world today and the best and the greatest of the world to come.